Hey, good morning. Welcome to another exciting edition of Business Law. What are we in? Week 11 already? Holy cow. Yeah, look at there. Just 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 left, and then, of course, a final. And by the way, our final is not comprehensive, okay? It'll just be over these last, what do you got? Test 5 is due then, so it'll be over 20, 21, 22. So just the last 3 chapters will be the final. So it's simply an ordinary test, I guess we could call that. So got to looking at the discussions, and while I would say that maybe somewhat disappointed over the quantity of the discussions for this past week, the quality was pretty good. Folks obviously did a little digging and supported their comments, and so the comments were pretty good. So I was happy to see that. I would encourage again comments and lots of them, and that's fine. And remember, you're not prohibited from posting just because it's not your group's week, right? So go ahead and post all you want. This week we get the fair use doctrine for intellectual property, which we just went over. So yeah, kind of I think a good topic. I've got a couple left to put in there. I know I've got some suggestions from some of our students, and I've probably got a few others in my key as well, but I never know what might come up between now and then. So I'll try to get those posted before that week, but feel free to bug me if I don't. So this week we get to talk a little bit about antitrust, and should be relatively quick, so we'll hopefully get through it. A little humor occasionally gives me a chance to get a drink of coffee and catch my breath, and away we go. So the learning objectives, right? And you guys can certainly look through those. I don't need to read them for you, but really in antitrust there's 2 major acts. The Sherman Act was the first one, I believe, in the late 1800s. I don't typically test on dates. I think the Clayton Act came around in 1914 or thereabouts, and just two, they're certainly related, and they certainly pertain to the same things, but one is more after the fact, which is the Sherman Act, and the Clayton Act is more preventative. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we get there. I guess I don't want to get into it too much. So why do we study it? And what is antitrust law, right? Again, it applies equally to small and large businesses. Most of the cases that we hear about, of course, are large businesses, right? It's Microsoft back in the 1990s when they had a monopoly on operating systems, and they did. Google has recently been under fire, especially over in Europe, under fire for maybe having monopoly power in the search side of things, right? And those are the ones we really read about and hear about, and honestly, they're the ones that mostly happen, right? But it can happen in smaller geographic areas too. You know, one business could try to force another one out through predatory pricing or something like that. And those are just as illegal on the local level. We just typically, it might happen in Omaha, but we're probably not going to hear about it up here in Havre. Okay, violations are serious. Okay, individuals could lose jobs if they're kind of responsible. Certainly fines, lots of fines, and possible imprisonment. We don't see a ton of imprisonment, but there is some. So what were trusts? What's the history? Trust, business owners originally, they transferred stock into trusts that were managed by folks for the benefit of them. And let me explain the history, I guess, as I kind of understand it. As you might imagine, in the late 1800s, before they had TV and video games and even NFL football, guys, and they were all guys, they were leaders of industry, etc. And so for entertainment, they'd sit around in the club and drink single malt scotch or bourbon and talk about business, right? And probably smoke good cigars. They could probably still get Cubans at the time. But anyhow, they'd sit and talk about business, and as you might expect, some of them were probably in the same business, but maybe they competed against each other or did things like that. I'm going to see if I can shut that off. There we go. And so what happened then is, they kind of said, if we quit beating each other up and competing against each other, we could make more money. And they figured out how to do that. They would take the stock of their companies, put it into a trust, and let the trustee manage those businesses for the benefit of all. And so as you might expect, if they were the only suppliers of oil, and that was kind of the big one at the time, even in the late 1800s, it was, I think they used heating oil and different things like that. It wasn't that much for transportation at the time, but it was becoming very popular, and so they were the only suppliers, and so they didn't have to worry about price competition and things like that, and so it was to their benefit, right? Okay, and so they became larger. Sometimes if they had smaller competitors, they might lower prices for the time being and squeeze out the competitors, right, so they could take over a market. Well, back then even we didn't have the internet, but we had newspapers, okay, and news accounts, trusts. We didn't even have radio, but we had the trusts, and they started, or we had newspapers, and they started to report on these trusts and some of their actions and whatnot. So Congress did respond with the Sherman Act of 1890, and it was the first antitrust law. In the early 1900s, then, says this guy was not president when the Sherman Act was passed, but he was the first president to actively pursue, the breakup of these large and dominant trusts. And of course, that's Teddy Roosevelt. You can kind of see right there, Rough Rider Teddy, who also said, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." And it was interesting. He was a Republican president, widely regarded, and Republicans even at that time were supposed to be the party of big business and whatnot, and yet he actively pursued the breakup of these dominant trusts. Okay, and so kind of contrary to what you might believe, at least from a historical standpoint. So that was the first. The Clayton Act came along in 1914, which set up the Federal Trade Commission. And then we had a couple of amendments. And I don't know that we actually will talk a whole lot about the amendments. We'll just talk about the two main acts and how they're enforced and what they look at, etc. So antitrust law, right? Many small competitors are better than a few or one large one, right? At least that's pretty much what we hold near and dear, right? An organization or individual should control production quantities or set prices of things, whether it be commodities or products or services, right? We do have some legal monopolies, and those monopolies are they are somewhat controlled, and we'll talk about those maybe as we go along here. So, kind of a couple of different assumptions. The Chicago School of Economics kind of believes that efficiency is the key consideration, so we should be less concerned about the size or the monopoly power that these individual companies might have, but more concerned about whether or not they are efficiently producing and delivering goods and services, whereas the Harvard School says just don't allow domination, period. If we've got a dominant player, we should break that player up. I can tell you, too, another company when we talk about this, and this was interesting, and it was in the 80s, and so I believe it was under Reagan, again another Republican president, and yet we had AT&T, and this was before your guys' time, but you don't realize that all long distance in the United States was controlled by AT&T. They had a legal monopoly, actually, at the time over long distance rates. They owned all of the wires, that everything was over the wires, right? They were all landlines at the time, and AT&T owned all of them. And under the Reagan administration, I believe I think it was in '84. I hope I'm right. Anyhow, they decided to break up AT&T. I mean, honest to God, if you made a long distance phone call, you used AT&T. Okay, back in those days. And prices were much higher. In spite of inflation and everything that's happened since then, prices were way higher to make a long-distance phone call back then than they are today. And they broke it up, okay? And what they did is they broke it up geographically with forced them to accept agreements. You know, if they broke it up geographically, obviously here in the Northwest, you still wanted to make a long distance call to Florida. Basically, the Northwest region would rent the lines and have to pay something for the lines, okay, that might go down to Florida, right? This also allowed other companies to come in and start offering long distance services and rent the lines. They basically told AT&T that, you still own the lines, but you can't have monopoly power over those. We're going to open those up for other competitors. And what happened afterwards was just an unbelievably quick reduction in long distance rates. And then we saw, of course, the introduction of cell phones and other types of services that have kind of supplanted that. And long distance today is a free commodity almost. We pay for cell phone or landline, and virtually all of them come with free long distance, right? Doesn't really matter who we call or where we call, if it's in the U.S. or Canada. So really, for those of us old enough, it's been an amazing transformation. I mean, honestly, it used to cost, think about that back in the 80s, it'd probably be the equivalent of $1 or so today. It used to cost us 25 cents per minute to make a long distance phone call. You didn't dally. You called mom and dad from school and said, "Hi, I love you, send money, bye." That was about it. And you needed the money because you had to pay for your next long distance phone call. Again, the Sherman Act dealt with the trust. And then we had trustees, and the beneficiaries were the various owners of the stocks, that were put into the trust. Okay, it dealt with restraint of trade, and so any number of things can restrain trade. They give you the 3 C's: contracts, combinations, right, or conspiracies. So contracts between companies, combinations of companies, conspiracies by companies, okay, that would restrain trade. And price fixing was one of the main ones, but there could have been other things too that would restrain trade besides just price fixing. It dealt with monopolies, whether they were deliberate. And again, it really still had a lot to do with predatory conduct. So, a monopoly in and of itself, under the Sherman Act wasn't necessarily bad. Sometimes they just arose. If you were the first developer of a new product or service, and there were lots of new products and services coming in, for a long time you could probably say that Ford had a monopoly in the personal vehicles, right? But they didn't necessarily have predatory conduct, just the opposite. They were doing everything they could to get prices cheaper and get it into the common man's hands, okay? And obviously didn't prevent other companies then from joining the party. So gray areas, yeah, really gray areas when you look back in the history, okay? So the analysis is really 2 things. Okay, it's really 2 things: a per se illegality. I'll jump to that first, and that is automatic, let's call it. So you don't have to go any further. If a company is price fixing, boom, that's a per se illegality. We don't need any more proof. The rule of reasonableness is one that's far more gray. Okay, there's lots of gray areas in the rule of reasonableness that says, is this something that a reasonable person would look at and say that it restrains trade or whatnot? Okay, and so the circumstances are, completely important in a case like that. And really the courts distinguish case by case. Okay, there's also something, and we'll look at it, it's come up on the next one, called the quick look analysis, and we kind of call that the middle ground. What it really says is, okay, it doesn't meet the per se deal, but if we look at the rule of reasonableness, it's something that a normal person might look at and say, yes, that's a violation, and that would be a quick look analysis. So even though it's not a per se, it's still pretty obvious that it would be a violation, and so we can use this. Okay. Again, 3 elements have to be present: combination, contract, or conspiracy. Has to be unreasonable restraint of trade. Okay, and it has to involve interstate commerce. And we've already defined the per se standard, and you can kind of read that again there. But these are the ones that are it: price fixing and tying arrangements. This is, if you guys remember the big Microsoft antitrust, that was what they were getting them on, because when you bought a computer back then, and you guys are all, everything's mobile and modern now, but back then you bought PCs, and PCs came pretty much automatically loaded with Windows, Microsoft DOS, MS DOS, but when the internet started to come around, then not only did you get that, it was automatically, your computer was automatically loaded with Explorer, okay, or a version might have been called something different even before that, I'm not sure, okay, and that kind of was a tying arrangement, right, because you bought this computer and Explorer was for free. You could download other free products. I think Netscape was the big one at the time. I don't think Netscape exists anymore that I know of, but you'd buy this computer and that was tied in, right? And so what was happening was Microsoft was they weren't forcing you to. You could still go get Netscape, but kind of by default you used Explorer, right? And so they got into trouble in it, and the case went on for years and years and years, and actually by the end of the case it kind of became irrelevant because Google was starting to come around, and so it was really kind of interesting. But it did probably, those tying arrangements probably did put some of those other companies, if not out of business, certainly kept them from growing radically. Okay, group boycotts. So maybe a couple companies get together and say, hey, we're going to be the exclusive providers of your product, or we're it would be just the opposite. I'm sorry. We're going to boycott. Maybe we're some of the bigger retailers, and we're going to boycott your product unless you maybe agree to sell solely to us. Okay. So, or other agreements like that, right? But an agreement by several retailers, say, it wouldn't have to be retailers, but just as an example, to boycott a company unless, okay? And then dividing markets, and that could be either geographically or demographically or any of those types of things would be a per se standard. So you take west of the Mississippi, I'll take east of the Mississippi, and we won't compete against each other. Hey, Sherman Act sanctions, right? Could be subject to fines and imprisonment. And we don't see a ton of imprisonment, but some. It's enjoined by courts. So Sherman Act is enforced by the Department of Justice. Okay, we'll find when we get to the Clayton Act that's mainly through an administrative agency, the Federal Trade Commission, right? Things have to be beyond a reasonable doubt, which is or a preponderance. So this is civil, right? Preponderance of evidence would be a civil case. Beyond a reasonable doubt would be a criminal case brought against those companies. Can be subject to triple damages, and certainly property subject to seizure and forfeiture. Fines. Here is, this was the dot-com bubble, all kinds of mergers, acquisitions, and all kinds of stuff going on, and so we saw a lot of antitrust types of things kind of really dwindled down, right? And that's just through 2003. I don't know if I have any more update than that, sorry. Incarcerations, this is the actual number. So, again, big bump up, 7 folks, 28 folks maybe during the dot-com bubble, and we're down to 15 in 2003. And my guess is that's probably come down even more. The terms that they're spending are actually a little higher. So, for an individual probably to get jailed, it's going to have to be kind of willful and wanton, We're going to put those other buggers out of business and la-da-da, and that type of a thing. Most antitrust cases, at least the ones you read in the news and whatnot, their conduct might be kind of purposeful, but it's not really that, Microsoft, they always were trying to be a monopoly. They were trying to be the best competitor. They were trying really hard in Google too, right? Whether it's in Europe or here, they want to be the best. They want to be the only provider. They want to, and so their conduct's very purposeful in trying to become a monopoly, really, but they're not necessarily trying to put other groups out of business, not purposely anyhow. So there are some exemptions for the Sherman. Okay, insurance companies can have monopolies for certain products, for certain services, perhaps. Farm co-ops, they've done that for the rural areas. So if Senex Harvest States is the only provider in Glasgow for certain services and whatnot, okay, fine. Some shipping, as you might imagine, certain routes, railroad, barges, maybe those types of things, right? Certain routes have monopolies. That's just the way it is. Milk marketing, I don't know if anybody knows a good reason for that anymore, but back in the day they thought that that was important. Investment companies, and I'm not sure that that one would be a big deal now either. I suppose maybe they allow monopolies, like there's an investment company, one, TIAA Cref, that supplies our state, right? So those of us that work here, we get serviced by TIAA Cref, and that's, I suppose, considered a monopoly for that case. Yeah. My guess is that that's what's allowed there. Okay. State actions are exempt, so states can have monopolies. Labor unions and normal activities can. So we're represented by the MEA, AFT, or whatever the hell it is, and they can have a monopoly. They're the only union that represents us. Major League Baseball. Oh gosh, how come they would be given a monopoly? I went back to a case actually when there was a separate league that was forming, trying to get going, and they were coming along, and they had some teams in different cities and whatnot. It wasn't taking off real well, but they actually sued Major League Baseball and said, hey, we think that they're abusing their monopoly power and trying to force us out of business, and the case was actually going pretty well for the upstarts, and Congress kind of got together and said, baseball, Major League Baseball's like Mom and Apple Pie and Chevrolet or whatever. I mean, they're all American, and so they actually granted them an exemption. That same exemption sort of kind of applies to the other major ones. National Basketball Association and NFL are given certain exempt status. That's why they haul people's butts up in front of Congress sometimes when they talk about, because who the hell cares? Why is Congress meddling in baseball or those types of things? Well, this is the reason, because they've been granted certain exemptions. Major League Baseball has the biggest exemption, I guess, or the most dominant exemption, however you want to phrase that. Nora Pennington says immunity for lobbying, so we can have some lobbying monopolies. You don't hear much about those, so... Again, price fixing, kind of already talked about that, but it can be horizontal. So between competitors, they get together, we think this often of the gas stations locally, right? Hey, they're getting together and setting the prices high, so we have to pay too darn much for our gasoline, and we think that. Nobody's proven that yet, but that would be horizontal, right? Vertical would be a manufacturer, say, or perhaps a wholesaler setting the prices for retailers, okay? And that can be illegal too. They can't determine. They can set a manufacturer suggested, retail price, but they can't force the companies to agree to that. So you might see an MSRP, and you might see a price a little less or maybe a little bit more. And the manufacturer or wholesaler can't hold you to that. They can choose not to deal with certain businesses, maybe if they're selling everything for too cheap or something. So, and indirect price fixing, I don't remember what indirect price fixing is, so it won't be on the test. Right, horizontal, vertical. I suppose that would be where you're forcing, if you were, say, Walmart, and you were forcing them to sell something higher priced to somebody else, that could be considered indirect. Walmart being a huge buyer of certain products and services, and if they were indirectly causing the prices to be different for other groups. Territorial agreements, and could be horizontal, which is a per se, so that's dividing up territories. That companies might get together, and even though they're competitors, they might say, hey, you take the east, I'll take the west. Vertical is not per se, and for example, car dealerships are given territories, right? We won't introduce another car dealership in this area. We're going to let you be the car dealership in the area, and they're given territories, and that's kind of considered okay. That manufacturers, the way they've got their structure set up, but it's a case by case basis. If they did that, and knocked out other competitors as a result, then it could be considered a violation of the Sherman Act and could get in trouble. And probably not car manufacturers, but I'm trying to think of other industries where that could be the case. Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not coming up with any. And then other activities like concerted activities. Any concerted activities where companies get together. The key words again are to restrain trade. If they're getting together to restrain trade, they can cause all kinds of trouble. So international cases make up a lot of it. Lots of international cases, right? Okay. Because there can be cartels and they're getting together overseas and deciding to ship things or whatever here and set prices and do all those other things. Well, what types of influence? Again, I guess if you want to do business in the United States, if you want to sell your products and services here, and we're the biggest market in the world, you still got to comply with our laws. And so that's the leverage that our FTC or Department of Justice has over these foreign companies. So we get to the Clayton Act. Again, and the Clayton Act is a bit more proactive, I guess we would call it. Okay, and it created an agency, and we talked about agency law earlier, and so the agencies can get in and proactively look at these things, and in fact they approve or deny mergers that might happen ahead of time. Okay, whereas the Sherman Act would, back in those days, they'd just allow the merger to happen, and then if that created a monopoly, they'd come in after the fact. Okay, the Clayton Act tries to prevent those things to a certain extent, right? So they outlaw practices and similar things, or the same things with the Sherman Act, really, right? If it lessens competition or if it creates a monopoly, okay? Ease to the burden of proof. So we don't have that beyond a reasonable doubt, right? We don't even necessarily have a preponderance of evidence. This is the agency making some of these decisions, right? The Justice Department can certainly enjoin them, right? And if there is a violation and whatnot, can enjoin them, can issue injunctions too. An injunction might prevent a merger or acquisition. Triple damages, costs, fees, those types of things, just like with the Sherman Act. So, who is the merger? InBev and SAB Miller Coors, right? And what they do there, and this has gone to the Federal Trade. And again, InBev's a foreign-owned company, and they're going to be buying SAB Miller, which I believe is a domestic or U.S. company. And what they've said is that they're going to allow the merger, maybe. This is what they're talking about now because it's still really early in the process, but they might force the combined company to divest themselves of some assets, and in that case it might be some of the brands of beer might get divested from their combination. And you're talking about the two biggest brewers, I think, in the world right now going to combine and form one huge brewer in the world. So quantity purchase advantage, it says that companies can't, Walmart can't really force a company to sell to them cheaper. Now, there's some exceptions, right? And good faith transactions, so they've negotiated pricing due to changing conditions. Okay, cost justification, this mainly has to do with shipping, and so that's probably why Walmart does get a little break on some things, right? Because they order 10 gazillions of something, whereas the mom and pop store down the street orders 2, and it's easier to ship per item, 10 gazillion than it is to ship 2. Okay, and so there are some exceptions to this quantity purchase, and that is the Robinson-Patman Amendment. I guess I should have mentioned that would probably be on the test, but probably just in regards to the fact that it is the quantity purchase advantage. Okay, some other things, right? Tying contract, full line forcing. So again, what if you're a manufacturer? Do you require that they carry your full line? Okay, that could be. Again, it's going to be case by case, gray area type of thing, but that could be considered a violation. right? Reciprocal dealing, you pat my back, I pat your back, and we'll exclude others, or we will use it to restrain trade. Not good, right? Exclusive dealing, kind of similar. You will sell only to me. Again, if you're Walmart and you're the 800-pound gorilla in the room, you say, I'm not going to buy from you unless you sell exclusively to me. Okay, yeah, not really. And requirements contract might be similar. Got to look that one up right before I started this and see if I can remember. But that would be similar, or could be even exclusive dealing. Could be a requirements contract that says, we will buy up all your production, if you sell just to us. Okay, type of a deal. And I would guess there's companies on the edge. Costco does a lot of that. I don't know if they have contracts that say that, but I think they might say, hey, if you make it, we're going to buy it, and away we go. I don't know that they prohibit them from selling to other people. It's just that they're big enough that they end up buying all of it. So again, the enforcement, Department of Justice enforces the Sherman Act things. Okay, and the Federal Trade Commission, that administrative agency, does the Clayton Act. Types of mergers and acquisitions, horizontal. Okay, horizontal, so that's InBev and SAB Miller that just announced, right? Okay. Same industry, they're selling the same stuff, okay, and they're just decided to merge. Vertical is when we become integrated, right? And I think of Exxon, I think, and ConocoPhillips, and some of those oil companies' earnings just came out, and they weren't as bad as what people expected, with the price of oil as low as it has been. And why is that? Well, because they're vertically integrated, right? They not only drill for, fine, and do all that, but they refine oil, they wholesale it, and they retail it. Okay, and so they do all, throughout the whole thing, throughout the whole process, they take care of it. And so. So vertical integration would be if you were a seller, or let's say you were a explorer and just producer of oil, from the field, and then you bought a refinery. That would be vertical integration, right? You're expanding your capacity. You could take it. You could go to transporting too, right? You might do that, buy a pipeline or something. Okay, and so that's vertical integration. A conglomerate is when they're kind of unrelated. Think anything that Berkshire Hathaway does, right? They just bought Precision Craft Parts or something like that, which doesn't really have a lot to do with Dairy Queen, which they also own. Okay, or Brooks Shoes, which they also own, or the BNSF, which they also own, right? So that's a true conglomerate. Just all kinds of different businesses under one big roof, sort of. And types of mergers could include market extensions, where that's vertical integration, kind of the same thing, right? Where we might purchase we might purchase the refinery or the pipeline or that type of a thing, or the retail. Okay, a market, that's the market, I'm sorry. And then geographic would be where we might just expand our territory. Okay? We might expand into new areas geographically. So. And Federal Trade Commission Act, that was probably one of the amendments or whatever, but under the Clayton Act, right? Again, we don't allow unfair competition. Anything restrains trade, we take a look at, but they're all gray areas. Okay, does it injure consumers, offend public policy, oppressive, immoral, unscrupulous, unethical? So all really, really gray, subjective areas, right? But the primary function for the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, is prevent monopolies and those types of abuses from happening. And there's just a little deal about a possible DirecTV and Dish merger. It was denied, or it appeared that it was going to be denied, and so the companies backed out. Okay, and so they're still separate. And they thought it might be a monopoly at the time. I think their argument's a lot more powerful now. There's so many now alternatives to watching TV that, for Dish and Direct to combine, I wouldn't think would be a big issue now if they were to do that. But Direct just got and talk about, vertically integrating. Direct was just bought by AT&T. Going back, all kinds of companies that have been involved with all kinds of these monopoly types of things or breakups and whatnot. But AT&T bought Direct, so right, vertically integrating, just buying another means of, right, you might call that a market extension, right? Another means of delivering goods or services in this case. And so, yeah, all that's kind of interesting. So I don't know that Dish and Direct would now be in a position to merge, although AT&T could certainly make a push maybe to purchase Dish, and combine the two of them in a case like that. So interesting things to watch. That whole environment is changing so rapidly that to try to keep abreast of delivering the content and whatnot. You guys understand that far more than I do. I know my little guy hardly watches TV at all, but he carries around a smartphone, and he's watching things on that. I don't know if it's I have no idea. I hope it's not bad stuff, but that's what he watches, and I guess it's an interesting change that we're going through. Not necessarily bad change, just different. So there we go. We're done for the week. Yeah, that was a little bit quicker, so that's good. Just a few weeks left. We got another week or so before the next test. So thanks. Keep the discussions coming. Keep them good, and quantity and quality, please. And we'll talk to you next week.